How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the monthly EFF Austin Meetup. I know many of y'all, lots of familiar faces here tonight, who are newcomers who seen before. So we're going to cover a lot of ground tonight. Oh, hey, come on. We're going to cover a lot of ground tonight, and just to kind of set the stage, as like a new activist to the digital space, I'm probably coming from a place where I had very little knowledge of the political process. Certainly like 3-4 months ago, I was really down on it, and like, yeah, no, there's no way we're going to be able to change everything. Like, the government's already got all the control. You know, what really is there to do as an individual? And I found out about TxEPC through EFF-Austin around the time I joined. And as part of the coalition now, it's given me such a perspective change on what is actually still possible for citizens to influence, and that with some key knowledge in a few specific places, we can actually still move the levers of government in our favor. So I'm hoping that you'll come away with a similar impression tonight, a little bit more hope, and I want to now turn it over. Well, first, we always do announcements at the beginning, so if any of y'all would like to announce any upcoming meetups or interesting events on this topic in general, now's the time. Nothing really. Okay.
I'll lead off with one.
Yeah?
Just to demonstrate methodology of talking to one another. A lot of times, well, every month lately, I've been going to the Public Safety Commission meeting at City Hall every month.
Ooh, good for you.
It's riveting. But actually, it's kind of interesting for this sort of thing.
Yes.
So I wanted to bring y'all's attention to a new bit of information that came out. So the Real-Time Crime Center of the Austin Police Department has a network of 41 cameras. They call them HALO cameras, high activity location observation cameras, which are all static plants, like generally like down around 6th Street, there's a bunch. Initially it started off with a pilot in the Runberg area, 2009, 2010 timeframe. And they've steadily increased the amount of cameras, about $75,000 a pop, seems like. And so that information comes in real time. They can record whatever, pan and zoom, that sort of stuff. So, naturally it's a surveillance system. Anyways, the thing that was interesting was that they announced that they had developed a covert mobile HALO camera system, which apparently APD had built. That was sort of the inference that was made. And so I just wanted to pass that along in case anyone wanted to do an open record request, maybe to find out about something along that. Yeah, so anyways, thought that was of note.
How would one make an open records request?
You would talk to the Public Information Office of APD or the city, and we should have an entire meetup on that, actually.
Sounds good.
It's real easy. I can give it to you in one sentence.
Yeah, go ahead.
Send an email, cite the Texas Public Information Act, and list what you want, and that's it. So the Public Information Office.
Okay.
And the more specific things you list, the more likely you are to get something.
As with all similar like public records FOIA requests.
Invoices, memos, emails, correspondence.
Rather than just saying everything
Backup
you have.
documents. Yeah.
It's FOIA if you're doing with federal government.
Right. This would be the
Texas Public Information.
The local equivalent of FOIA.
Here.
And if you use muckrock.com to do so, then you can look at other requests people have put in, use them as a template, and they process everything in terms of keeping you on the calendar that's established, as well as scanning all of the documents that you get back and posting them publicly online. So not only is it useful for you, but for everyone online, which is an important thing that they're doing.
Yeah. Bring it out in the sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have an announcement?
I have a question. It seems like many people here know each other, and several of us are new.
Okay.
So I would like to ask that, since it's such a small group, we go around and introduce ourselves.
Can
we do that?
Just name who you're with, and I don't know, how long have you been in Austin? Kathy?
Kathy Mitchell, I'm not really with anyone, and I've been in Austin for 25 years. Texas Ed.
Okay, 25 years. That's the number to beat, everybody. She's a true Austinian.
Beat it.
Yeah?
I got to Austin. I arrived in Austin in 1971.
And who are you?
Claire James, and I was with TxEPC for the last session, and we got some stuff done. I had never done anything like this, and I just followed Scott around a lot and figured it out. And I just want to say, don't feel too overwhelmed just because you aren't a lawyer or can't get as deep into the nitty-gritty of it all. Doesn't mean that you can't help a lot, especially when it comes to the big pushes where we all have to go around and talk to legislatures and just kind of do the intro. So that's, yeah.
Cool, thanks. Go around this way.
Cyrus Barucha, I'm a patent attorney here in town, an ex-physicist, and a privacy nut.
Awesome. How long have you been in Austin?
20 plus.
Cool.
There are ex-physicists. I thought once a physicist always.
I am a physicist.
That was surprising.
It still is.
Tom?
Tom Brown, programmer. I've been in Austin off and on since 2002.
Cool.
Travis Nagley, Texans for Accountable Government Coalition Partner, TxEPC.
Kelly Slavic, 10th Amendment Center and offnow.org.
And pretty new to town?
Pretty new to town.
Welcome.
I'm sorry,
I've been here
say
for
that
10
site
years.
again, offnow.org.
Offnow.org.
It's really important, 10th Amendment Center, but.
Is that Texas Public Policy Foundation?
Say it again?
Or 10th Amendment Center, is its own?
It's its own thing.
Oh, okay.
Cool.
Dave Sanford, I've been here 14 years. I don't think I'm affiliated, right?
Okay, welcome.
I'm Chris McConnell, I've been here about 10 years.
Brandon Besmar, been here about a year, and I'm a communications professional, and I do work in political communications consulting. I'm interested in the EFF because, you know, I'm an American.
Yeah.
Does stuff on the internet, right? Cool.
I'm Sahini. I'm now studying at the 6 months only, and I study at the UT.
Cool.
Debbie Russell, I'm a longtime ACLU volunteer in Austin. 17 years?
No.
I can't remember. Yes.
My name's Tom King. I've been in Austin since 1986.
Scott.
Scott Henson, I write a blog called Grits for Breakfast, and was one of the lead lobbyists for the Electronic Privacy Coalition last session.
My name is Rebecca. I am working with the ACLU specifically on electronic privacy issues, and I've lived in Austin for about 4 years. So I suppose I'm a newbie.
On the cusp.
Yeah.
Matt.
I'm Matt Simpson from the ACLU of Texas, and I moved back to Austin in 2007, so 7 years.
Welcome back. Well, great suggestion.
Are you a cartoonist?
I'm not. I'm an exact contemporary of Tom King, cartoonist, but no, I'm not he.
Good question. Well, thank you all for joining. We're going to have 4 speakers tonight, starting with Gregory Foster of EFF-Austin, and then we're going to have Scott and Kathy talk a little bit about the process. Greg's going to introduce us to the tech involved with this legislation. Kathy and Scott are going to kind of go over the political processes in more detail, and then Matt's going to talk a little bit about how you can get involved locally with TxEPC. But that's all I got to say. Greg, take it away.
Okay, can you
Switch you over.
do the technical piece? So,
Magic.
certainly want to thank everyone for showing up tonight. So, what we're going to talk about tonight is the Texas Electronic Privacy Coalition. I'm going to start off just talking a little bit about the technical aspects, since this is the EFF-Austin community, and help you all understand kind of what's that data piece of the puzzle, what's that infrastructure piece of the puzzle that connects up for the reason why we're interested in doing some legislative work at the state. And my colleagues will follow up on all of that. So really it all boils down to this. When it comes to geolocation privacy, we would like law enforcement to get a warrant. If they want that information, regardless of really where the source is. And so we're tackling particular pieces of that puzzle, particular pieces of the geolocation data. And so it might be worthwhile to then say, well, what exactly are we going to talk about here? So first, the geolocation data piece. I want to talk about GPS data versus cell tower data, historical versus real-time data. And then we'll talk about some of the devices that we're targeting specifically, GPS trackers, everything having to do with your own mobile personal device tracker, and MC catchers or StingRays, as they are called. So really, first, let's just talk about the data, make sure we're on the same page. Geolocation, if you look at a particular event, it's a particular location and a particular time. And so one way this data can be encapsulated is in GPS coordinates. And so GPS, global positioning system, constellation of 20 some odd satellites, originally a military network or a military satellite network that was subsequently opened up to the public domain. And so your phone can connect to that network, receive the satellite signals to get fairly accurate latitude and longitude positions. So that's one kind of geolocation data. Another kind is associated with the mobile network that you're connected to with your mobile devices. So this is just a picture of from antennasearch.com of all of the towers and antennas within a 4-mile radius of this spot. So generally that information is publicly available because the FCC requires the registration of these towers and antennas. And so, there's a lot just within a particular area. And so whenever your phone is connected to that mobile network, it's constantly basically connecting to the different towers in your area. And so certainly not only when you're making a call or making a text, basically all the time, the mobile network needs to know where you're at so it can route incoming calls. So your phone's in constant communication with this network. And so that information is recorded by the providers, and you can make that correlation, like I'm connected to this particular tower. That tower has a geophysical location. And so it's not as accurate as GPS data associated with your device, but as you can see, that is getting more and more accurate over time. So another way to look at this data and why it's important is that it's not just single events that we're talking about, but lots of events aggregated together, lots of geolocation data points, which describe where you've been and where you go and who you associate with, what restaurants you frequent, what you do on the weekends. All of that is indirectly recorded through these points. This particular map was actually from 2011, iOS 4. Folks found out that there was a data file in there which is tracking your actual location points. So that's just a rendering of that particular data stream. So, but there's also real-time data. So like this is Google Maps where we're at right now. And so that's a different kind of data than going back and requesting a historical picture of where you've been. That requires a different sort of arrangement with the mobile providers. So again, GPS data, tower data, real-time data, historical data. So now let's look at some of the particular devices. So this is a picture of an actual GPS tracker that is, you're looking at the underside of a car, so it's got a magnet that's applied and the device itself is just directly physically attached to the vehicle and broadcasts its location information to law enforcement that are tracking that. So that's a kind of device that can generate, in this case, probably that's going to be GPS level data, since it's GPS tracking. So this is important to kind of set the stage, because I mean that's a kind of clumsy, it requires physical application of the device. It is a physical device. And so in 2012, early 2012, there was a really important Supreme Court decision that was handed down, unanimous, United States v. Jones, mandated that the use of GPS trackers by law enforcement requires a warrant. And the majority opinion in that particular case stated that the reason why that actually was a violation of the Fourth Amendment in this particular case, where it was just a device they just used and said later, oh, look, we busted this fellow. So they said in the majority opinion, which I believe Scalia actually wrote, they said that since there was a physical trespass that was required to apply the device, then that's where it really broke down in terms of the Fourth Amendment. You had to trespass into the physical space of this property that belongs to someone else. So that's an important piece of the puzzle, because it really talks to this being a physical device that's applied. The minority opinion in that, which was also in concurrence, unanimous decision, stated that there was something categorically different about this type of data collection, in that you were collecting data over time. If it was one piece of geolocation data, then maybe this wouldn't have been such a big deal, maybe. But since they attached this device and recorded the information over a period of weeks, in fact, it was 4 weeks, I believe, they said that there was a qualitative difference in terms of the privacy expectations that an individual would have in this case. So that later became described as the mosaic theory, where you have a mosaic is just lots of little pieces that individually don't really show something, but you step back, you look at the larger picture, you actually see something about that person which you don't from those individual pieces. So that was an important precedent, and which we will be coming back to for years and years. So next up, another data source is your personal tracking device that you are pretty much probably everyone here is carrying. Any mobile device, really. And so these devices, which are awesome, are, again, if they're connected to the mobile networks, they're constantly producing information. And so this is where we depart from that United States v. Jones opinion, because now we're talking about not needing a physical trespass to get data from these third-party providers, and also you're interacting with the business records of a third party. So while my phone, which I may think of as my phone, maybe I even bought it, since I'm connected to a mobile network, and that network is providing me with service, I'm in a business contractual relationship, and they're signed off on the terms of service with that network provider. As a result, all of the records that they generate, certainly not just your billing records, but all of that data belongs to them, doesn't belong to you. And so law enforcement goes to the third party and says, we'd like that data because it's a business record. There's no privacy interest that the individual has, or no privacy recourse that the individual has in that data. So the mobile providers have become kind of a extension, I guess you could say, they are an extension of law enforcement. And that is a old tradition that goes back to the telegraph companies. So to understand this a little bit better, well, we've already talked a little bit about the mobile networks, the structure, the cell towers and such. So suffice it to say, there's a lot of them. It's getting more and more detailed. There's devices called femtocells, which are kind of your own personal little house cell tower, which you can get from your broadband provider if you don't get very good cell service in your area or for whatever reason. And this is an extension of the mobile network. It's just that these devices are now even in our homes. So if your cell phone connects to the device in your home, that's even more accurate information about your geophysical location. I think these are also used in private businesses, maybe even at the Capitol.
Oh, everywhere.
So like if there's underground locations, that sort of thing, to extend the networks. So the accuracy going through that cell tower identifier is more and more accurate and will only get more so as the network gets more dense. So what kind of data do these providers actually have? The focus of TxEPC's work during this legislative session is on the geolocation data. So kind of that lat long, the actual physical location, date and time stamp associated with that. I wanted to highlight this just because there's, and this is certainly dated for one, it's 2010 aggregation of information, just showing you that there's lots of different information. Certainly the subscriber information is just who you are, your address, that sort of thing. Call detail records, this is the metadata program. So the NSA has all of the call data records basically for everyone dating back to 2001 from what we've been able to gather. And that's the who you called and when, or the numbers rather, not necessarily the who, just the numbers. Here you see the cell towers used by the phone. In this case, Verizon was keeping that data for a year. T-Mobile officially stating 4 to 6 months, but really a year. AT&T, they just kept it since 2008. So lots of data there. So you have to ask, I think just from a personal perspective, if you know who your provider is, you can look at them critically just in terms of what is their data retention schedule? Like how much of my data is going to be accessible, and maybe use that as a guiding light in terms of choosing which provider is better than the others. And although there's not really any shining lights in that realm. So another way of looking at this data is, well, what is the volume of requests that law enforcement's making for this data, just to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge that's in front of us. So this is a quote that Christopher Segoyan got from a conference in 2009 where this electronic surveillance manager for Sprint Nextel made this quote that said they had rolled out an automated web portal for servicing law enforcement requests. And in the year and a month that they had had it up, that portal had processed 8 million requests for GPS data from their tool. So, and we're seeing this in general, all providers, if for no other reason than not being able to staff up and field the amount of requests that they get for this sort of data from law enforcement, they are moving towards these automated web portals where basically the way things stand now, this kind of data can be requested by law enforcement with an administrative subpoena. And this is an important piece to understand the distinctions. And please, if y'all can clarify this as we're going along.
And I'll get into that later.
Okay, excellent. We'll leave that for Scott. Let's say that the standard for getting an administrative subpoena is pretty much calling up your district attorney and saying, I need this. They say, okay. Whereas with a warrant, you have to go before a judge, you have to establish probable cause, you have that judicial oversight, which is, we think, increasingly important. So that's 2009 too. Keep that in mind. All right. So another form in which this data is requested is through what are called tower dumps. And this is just a different way of cutting across all of that huge amount of event data associated with everybody's phone connecting to these networks. So this is just another way of saying, show me all of the data from a certain tower or a certain set of towers over a period of time. And that's going to return all the data for everyone's device that was within that geophysical vicinity at that time period. So it does not in any way particularly describe the information required and scoops up everyone's data. So the example that's given often of how this is used, and it is quite useful as a law enforcement tool, say there's a robbery at a certain location. They can go to the mobile providers who have towers in the area and say, okay, well, show us all of the cell phones that were in that area through one of these tower dumps. And then you have kind of the haystack has gotten smaller of the people who may possibly have been the culprits who actually committed the crime. So, do you have a question?
Administrative subpoena for that too?
Yes.
Yeah, and just to add a bit to that, the way it's really used is like, say there are multiple crimes that are similar. And so the first time it was ever used was a case in New York where there had been a dozen bank robberies. And they did cell tower dumps for the closest cell tower around each of those banks during the time that the robberies had occurred. And when they cross-matched them, there were only 2 people whose cell phones had pinged all 12 cell towers, and so those were their suspects. And so that's sort of how it's used in the real world. For one event, it's not really that useful because it might give you 30,000 people whose phone had pinged that cell tower, but for every additional one you get, you whittle it down, and the people who are in common are then your suspects.
And so this also highlights tower dumps are an interesting way to kind of come at this data because you have so much innocent, so many people's data who are completely innocent of having anything to do with what may be investigated, yet all of their data is scooped up by law enforcement. And retained. So it's this question of, okay, like we want to help, and the telephone service provider should want to help solve crimes, right? Okay. But what happens with that data after it leaves their supervision, I guess you could say. And that's why it's important to have data retention calendars, some means of auditing that this sort of data is actually expunged when it's supposed to be, that sort of thing. So we're looking at those things and trying to figure out, is there a way that we can approach this generally from the perspective of how this data propagates and how long this data's lifetime is. Let's see. So I just wanted to, this is more for the EFF-Austin folks, wanted to highlight that there are other vectors of attack on mobile networks. And there's a link here to this talk at 31C3 that was just at the end of December. So the SS7 network is how mobile network providers communicate with one another. It's sort of an internal network shared amongst all mobile network providers. It's been shown that if you have access to this network, which allegedly only the 2,000 or so providers that have access to this network can participate in it, but there's apparently no authentication that goes on in this network, and you can, from anywhere in the world, reroute calls, record the content of calls, retrieve all of the subscriber data. So I recommend checking out that talk just to give you a sense of how broken things really kind of are. And as well, use that as a segue to talk about this app, which you can use, Snoop Snitch, which is announced in that talk also. This is a Android-based application that you can install, which gives you some sense of monitoring or detecting possible abuse of the network that you're connected to. So we'll talk in a moment about MC catchers, but allegedly it can detect fake base stations like MC catchers. And you can also share back the data that you're actually generating through this application to get a better sense of, say, for instance, where MC catchers are frequently used. And so with that, let's jump over to that next device, StingRays, which is the Harris Corporation brand of these MC catcher devices. These are fake cell towers that law enforcement can use. So we've seen kind of this progression from these GPS trackers require physical trespass to actually apply them, to going to a third party for the data, where that third party ostensibly could provide some level of check on accessing that data. Third party could say, no, actually, we want you to have a warrant to get that data. Now you've got pirate cell towers, which law enforcement can use, so they don't need to go to that third party, and they don't need to do physical trespass to get the data. So these devices, wherever they're clearly portable, you can throw it in the back of the cruiser, fire it up. You've got your own fake cell tower advertising to all of the cell phones in the area with a stronger signal than any of the other cell towers in the area, so they will automatically connect to your device and start siphoning up certainly the IMSI numbers, that unique identifier associated with each phone. So we know that the Department of Public Safety, Houston Police Department, and Fort Worth Police Department all have these devices. There's been a lot of secrecy around the use of these devices and their deployment. And there's a whole tricky little bit there about Harris Corporation establishing a non-disclosure agreement with the Federal Communications Commission, or the federal FCC and the FBI, so that any local law enforcement or state law enforcement agency that purchases one of these devices has to actually sign this non-disclosure agreement with Harris and with the FBI, saying they won't tell anyone, including judges, including, we have recently discovered, even prosecutors who are generally regarded as kind of on the same team as law enforcement. They won't even tell the prosecutors that they're using these devices, which is one of the things that TxEPC is looking at closely. So anyways, that's the city council motion in Houston.
Meaning that they can't then turn over the data to the prosecutors?
They can't say where it came from.
They just don't say where it came from.
And don't tell them when they're using it or really anything about it. Lie and they make up confidential informants and say the information came from there instead of the StingRay. It's created a lot of weird situations where police are misleading prosecutors and judges. And in Florida, they got in a lot of trouble over it that hadn't gotten litigated to that extent here in Texas yet.
You had a question?
Yeah, to what extent does the use of these, the StingRays, the fake cell towers, degrade the quality of
the mobile network?
Yeah, or, well, no, actually the quality of the information that's gathered from means which are at least somewhat more legal? Are they local enough so it really doesn't make a difference?
Well, the broadcast range for them, I think, is a couple of kilometers. I'm not exactly certain on that. Certainly it is illegal to, for the common folk to interfere with the spectrum that the mobile networks are utilizing. But the FCC said it was okay. So, that's sort of a good point.
I'm just wondering if the StingRays are going to make the NSA data worse or something else like that. Not that I'm deeply worried about.
No, because your phone is pinging to lots of different cell towers all the time. And so what the StingRay does, your bottom line, most phones today are operating on a 3G or a 4G network, but they are capable of operating at a 2G level. And what the StingRay is doing is tricking your phone into thinking that the most powerful local tower is a 2G. But that doesn't mean that as soon as they're done using it or you've moved down the street, that it won't just ping the other nearest tower. I mean, you saw how many data points there were. Your phone pings the nearest tower about every 45 seconds, so that the phone company will know where you are in case they need to send you a phone call. I mean, it's functional, it's not that they're trying to track you for nefarious reasons. But there's so many pings to the cell tower that it would not probably degrade the data significantly for NSA.
Are calls routed through these boxes?
They can be. So,
well, they are routed. The question is whether the government, when he had that thing up there, there's a switch on there that you can flip and collect content. And you can choose to collect content or not collect it, depending on what authority you have from the judge.
So the Snoop Snitch app here, one of the ways that it tries to detect that you may be interacting with a fake base station or a fake cell tower is, as Scott was saying, it will try to encourage your phone to step down to 2G levels, because then that encryption is basically non-existent or can be easily broken. So content can be collected in that circumstance. So what these folks have been working on is being able to detect that. Unfortunately, it's only for Qualcomm chipset phones, because that's the only kind of baseband infrastructure that they've been able to get through through the Android OS. So bringing it home locally, Mr. John Anderson, who's in the back row here, has been writing some real good articles for the Austin Chronicle, including this one, based on open records requests that he has been filing, where he found out that the local Austin Police Department has been in communication with the Department of Public Safety saying, how do we get one of these for ourselves? These are great. So, and the last, looks like this is about mid last year, the last sort of picture or window we have in on that. Are there any updates that you have on it? Okay. So then just to throw on a little bonus device for all of you to keep this in mind.
Yay, dirt boxes.
You know, we're talking about doing work on the state level to require warrants for geolocation data. And so that would affect the state troopers, it would affect all local law enforcement. But you also have federal law enforcement to be thinking of. And so one of the techniques they use is they basically put an MC catcher, it's a DRT box, DRT being the company, a Boeing subsidiary. It's like a flying MC catcher basically. And so they put it in a Cessna, scoop up all of the data there. And at least this graphic infers in this Wall Street Journal article that's linked from the slides, we'll share those later, that's then shared with local law enforcement to provide geolocation accuracy on phones that they're looking for. So then real fast in summary, like why we're here, why we're looking at all of this stuff. We think there should be probable cause established to avoid any sort of fishing expedition sort of situations. We think there should be judicial oversight over the use of these technologies. And we want to see there to be some sort of constraints on use through the law, especially for those situations like with the MC catchers where that's direct, there's no third party, there's no judicial oversight. So that's just some infos.
Back for a second.
Sure. So any questions that come up for now? Sure.
Does any of the proposed state-based legislation have the capacity to affect law enforcement agents while working with, or federal law enforcement agents while working within the state?
No.
Yep.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Good.
Yep, that's a whole other deal. So I'm going to hand this off next to Kathy Mitchell.
Scott's going to go next.
Which one can we go next just for the
The legal
thematic?
framework, I think, is probably where people's heads are at now.
All right, yeah, sounds good. And Scott Henson with Grits for Breakfast and TxEPC.
All right. Thanks.
Word yet?
All right. Thank you, Greg. You did a great job, and I'll try to stay brief and move things along because Greg did do a good job of covering a lot of these topics. But I wanted to give you all just a very brief sense of the legal framework that we're dealing with. And
TxEPC actually began working on this nearly a year before the Edward Snowden revelations, and those occurred right at the end of the 2013 legislative session. And quite frankly, if that had happened 2 months earlier, we would not be here today, because we would have passed that bill overwhelmingly, and it would already be law that we would need warrants in Texas. We didn't have that sort of mass public education at the time in 2013 when we brought this. The biggest question that legislators had was, well, is this really a thing? Is anyone really doing this? Does anyone care? The information like Greg showed about 8 million requests in the first year to one company, people didn't believe us. People thought that we were describing something that was science fiction, and reality had caught up with science fiction. Anyway, this legislative session, now that Snowden has happened, now that everyone has heard the word metadata, no one knew that word 2 years ago. Everyone knows that word today. I think we're actually going to have a much better chance at passing this. Just to back up and give you the big picture framework, our big trouble with our laws, state and federal, on these topics is that when you read them, they are almost nonsensical. You cannot, I used to work on Medicaid, and I have never seen more poorly written statutes in my life than the federal. I've read thousands of statutes. Never in my life worse than the federal statutes governing this and Article 1821 of the Code of Criminal Procedure and the state statutes. It's unbelievable. I defy anyone to look at those laws and tell me what law enforcement has to do to get to see it, or what restrictions there are. You could get 5 lawyers in a room and you're going to get 8 opinions about what you have to do, and lawyers within the same DA's office disagree often over what it means. I had a conversation with the Harris County District Attorney recently, and they were telling me, well, this is our interpretation, but all the other DAs interpret it differently. Well, no one knows. No one knows what these laws mean. And it's because politicians are writing about tech who have no clue about the tech at all. At the federal level, the law governing these statutes is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, which was written in 1986, which you might immediately realize is before, say, email, or a decade before the web. And all of the things that we now just take for granted as our daily lives, they had no clue about in 1986. But even worse, here's the crazy part. The law was not up to date technologically for 1986. The terminology in that federal statute is actually based on computer tech from the late 60s. The statute is designed of thinking of a computer as a large box that fills a huge warehouse that has lots of air conditioning units, cooling the warehouse. And you might have, say, 100 people who have terminals that all connect to that one big mainframe computer. And this is before anyone had a PC. Steve Jobs didn't exist then. This is these huge mainframe PCs. And so you might have a terminal that connects to a single computer, and any electronic communications was between people at these terminals. And without going into all of the antiquated terminology that describes that no one uses anymore, all of the terminology in both the Texas and the federal statutes governing this relate to that mainframe era tech, where you didn't even have independent computers that might speak to each other. It was only like on the same computer. And so all of the assumptions underlying the statutes at the state and federal level are truly nonsensical. They actually make no sense. It's not just that the tech has changed, it needs to be updated. It's gobbledygook. No one can really tell. And the cops and the prosecutors love it that way. Because if there's no way that anyone can tell what the restrictions on them are, then there are no restrictions. And so that is basically where we are at today at the state and federal level, especially on geolocation data. On content, at the state level here in Texas, we last session, the Texas Electronic Privacy Coalition, got passed a piece of legislation that required a warrant for content, for cloud-based content, to access your email or whatever else you have stored in the cloud, your Google Drive documents or whatever it is you've got stored there, anything that's stored in the cloud. When you read the federal law, on its face, it says that they can get that with a subpoena if it's material and relevant to a case. As a practical matter, again, the federal law is gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything. The courts have taken over, and now the circuit courts have begun interpreting the Fourth Amendment to require warrants for content, and there are several circuits that have formally installed that restriction. And basically what's happened is the Attorney General has realized that they're losing that case in every single district and every single circuit that they fight it in, and so they've stopped appealing. And so there's about four circuits where they've come up with that you have to have a warrant ruling. The Supreme Court's never ruled on it. But because the AG knows they're just going to lose now, they've stopped appealing, and that means de facto your content now has a warrant requirement at both the federal and state level. At the state level here in Texas, and that's not state level everywhere else, that's just here in Texas. We're the only state that's passed that statute. Here in Texas, it's a statutory restriction that says they have to get a warrant. At the federal level, it's sort of a de facto, okay, I guess we'll get one. And but that's for the content piece. For geolocation data, this US v. Jones case that Greg pointed out is the closest thing that we've had that's on point, but it's really not on point because of this issue with the third-party providers. And just to give the tiniest bit of legal background, and I don't want to bore you with too much case law, but bottom line, we're talking about something that's called the third-party doctrine. That's really the phrase you need to remember from this about what the big problem is. And the third-party doctrine means that if you share your information with some vendor or business that you work with, that you have willingly given up that information, and so you no longer have a privacy interest because you have chosen to give that information up. And there were two cases in the 70s. This is a very recent doctrine. This is something that was not Supreme Court doctrine until 35 years ago or something. There were two cases. One was Smith v. Maryland, that was about whether cops can get what's called trap and trace data, which is all of the phone numbers that your phone called and that called back to you. It's not location data, but it sort of gets to some of this data that the cell phone providers have. And the Supreme Court said, no, you handed that over to a third party. They know, the phone company knows who you called, so we get to know too. And so to this day, no warrant to get that information from your
Supreme Court ruled that? You said the
Supreme Court ruled that in a case called Smith v. Maryland. It was either the year before or the year after, I can't remember. But there was another case, very similar, about banking information. And Miller versus somebody, I forget what state. And once again, the Supreme Court ruled, well, you gave all your financial information to your bank, and so obviously, you shared it, and so you have no privacy interest over it, and applied that same third-party doctrine to banking information. Well, Congress freaked out, and immediately, within about 9 months, if you can imagine anything passing in Congress in 9 months these days, but this was the 70s, turned around and passed a statute that says, no, you still have privacy interest in your banking records. They have to get a warrant out. So that's sort of the model, is that right now, under the law, in most cases, if you give information to any vendor, and these days, think how much more information we give to third parties than we did in the 70s when you weren't so connected. I mean, my God, the Internet of Things is about to explode. Your refrigerator is going to be snitching on you soon. The amount of data that is being handed out to third parties, in this day and age is mind-boggling. And the idea that you have no privacy interest over it is shocking to the conscience of most people when you tell them today. In the 70s, when the tech didn't have that many ways to access it, when you had one phone company and everything was a lot simpler, the courts felt they could justify it, but they're struggling with these issues right now. And I'll just wrap up by saying that the best way to do this is through passing laws. Letting the courts do this just in a hodgepodge manner. Judges know less than legislators about tech. I mean, at least with legislators, we can send our tech people up there to explain to their staff and explain to the members and testify and give them advice. Judges just hear from a couple of lawyers who also don't know anything about tech. Maybe they hear from your hired gun expert witnesses on both sides, but don't have enough knowledge to distinguish between who's right and who's wrong. And basically, it's a blind leading the blind situation. And the courts, while they're just meandering vaguely toward a better place on content and all, it's stop and start. There's a lot of really just weird dynamics because they're basing their cases on precedents that don't take into account the changes in technology. I mean, you were right that government has been accessing communication since the telegraph, but the nuts and bolts of how that occurs has changed a lot. And the complexity of those interactions has changed a lot. And so we really feel like this has to get done with intention, where someone sits down and writes a law and says, this is how it needs to be done, and if there are other interests that have a stake, then hey, we negotiate it out, and that's how laws are written. But just leaving it up to the courts and saying, oh, we have a Fourth Amendment, that'll take care of itself, is probably just a fool's errand. And so this really is a necessary and important and very sort of timely and really bleeding edge issue. Texas is ahead of the game on this. We started before anyone ever heard of Edward Snowden, and our bill on location data in the House had 107 joint and co-authors out of 150 House members. It passed 126 to 4 in the House and died for procedural reasons, essentially, last session. But we're well positioned. It's the right time and the right place, and we're going to take a big stab at it this go round. So, if you have any questions, I'll take a stab. Yeah.
So, if I'm not mistaken, the Texas Center has model legislation, right, that different states are able to utilize in their own pursuit of these agendas. Is there any organization that we're aware of, from the ACLU to the EFF to anyone really, who's following that template, developing model legislation and then working to penetrate states with that legislation?
Both ACLU and EFF have model bills on different aspects of different electronic privacy stuff, and I'm not sure if they overlap too much or if the national groups are sort of divvying up areas. I know they work together quite a bit, but there is some model legislation. In our case, our model legislation was written by Kathy here, who pulled out our statute because it's model legislation is never specific to the state, and your statute that exists is incredibly detailed and has a detailed outline, and you can't just superimpose a model. And again, we started ours sort of before this became the national thing. So I'm not sure, to be honest, that ours follows any of the model legislation per se. It's sort of its own baby. But that's right. We got some advice from the ACLU tech expert there.
I think there might have been a model bill somewhere at the very far beginning, but we definitely moved from in this case.
No, I remember the days.
There are like a list of basic tenets, like when you're advising states or okay, these are the issues, these are how we want to recommend you approach them, and no matter who you are, this is our perspective, and this is how we like to see you do it.
I think I would like to speak to that I'm not coming up next, and I'm going to be talking more about sort of the strategy and how we do the grassroots lobbying piece and get bills passed. So if you don't mind, I'd like to speak to that in a moment.
Maybe I'll touch really quickly because we are, ACLU is the one national, or I guess it's national, but we do what you're talking about. And actually we have kind of two approaches. One is the model legislation, which is definitely useful. It has limits, kind of as Scott described. The other thing that's really useful is we kind of keep all the other, we call them affiliates, but all the other ACLU state level groups. Kind of everybody stays updated on who has the best in any given state, right? So Utah just passed something not too long ago that I think covers some interesting ground. Kathy and I were looking at it as we were looking at legislation for next session to try to get something to address these MZ catchers and the StingRays, and they have, quite honestly, they kind of took a step back and said we need to regulate kind of when data is purged or when it's collected, and maybe not even worry as much about each individual technology. So there's some kind of new approaches, I think, each legislative cycle, honestly. So it's something that people keep up with. And actually, that's one thing, being a part of this work, and you may say this next, Kathy, but I think one of the things that we kind of are trying to do is not just push the conversation in Texas, but if Texas does things, the rest of the country does. Absolutely. And so I think, speaking from the ACLU's perspective, I know the ACLU at the national level is very interested in the work we do in Texas, because they feel like they can pitch that in other states and say, well, Texas did it. Can't you guys get it together? Connecticut or whatever.
Right. And that's happened on a lot of criminal justice reform issues in particular. If Texas does it, then, it's easy to convince Massachusetts to do it if we did it. So, or somebody else, Tom.
Just very quickly, assuming arguendo that meaningful restrictions can be placed on geolocation information and various third-party information, can we still end up screwing ourselves by restricting ourselves contractually when we sign terms and conditions of various apps, products, personal devices?
Well, that's a whole nother area, and the short answer is yes. This deals with the government, and the thing about the government is that the government has people that wander around with guns that can shoot you if you don't obey them, and they can lock you up in jail if you don't do what they say, and AT&T cannot. And so there's a limit. When you worry about how this information might be abused, government is where you want to go first, from a preserve liberty perspective. But you're absolutely right that the data that you hand over to private companies is then sold and resold. And in fact, the government eventually buys a bunch of it.
That is the loophole.
That is the big loophole. And it's a ridiculous problem, and what we're doing here doesn't get to that yet. It's not because we don't think it's a problem. It's because the way you eat an elephant's one bite at a time, and this is the bite that we think we can swallow this go round. But I'm sure a lot of the EFFers here have heard the story about the company in England that, as kind of a gag, did terms and conditions on their product that basically said that, you know, if you agree to use our service, you have sold your eternal soul to Satan, and, you know, you agree that you will spend 1,000 years, you know, in eternal torment, you know, in the lake of fire, and blah, blah, blah. And thousands of people just clicked, check on, go on, and after a few weeks, they revealed the gag, and it was quite a thing. But no one looks at what they're signing, and that information is frittered out everywhere. That is a tougher nut to crack, and the main reason that people aren't dealing with it legislatively is that no one knows what in the world to do about it. It's such a big, sprawling problem that, you know, for government, require a warrant. Okay, hey, I can say in a sentence what we should do, require a warrant. What do you do for the companies? Who knows? I don't know. If anybody knows, let us know. So.
Just real quick on that, there's an excellent documentary called Terms and Conditions.
Right.
I believe is available on Netflix.
Yeah.
Watched it last year, and it's a great overview of that, map of how complex that issue is.
All right. All right, thank you.
So I have a presentation. It's forget how to do it.
I got it.
Wait, where's the pluggy? The plug.
Wrapped up around the back here. There you go. Yeah. Right here.
Just let it go for a minute.
Yeah.
So I'm just here to brighten up the room. I know after all that, it's exhausting. It's depressing, but it doesn't have to be. I've been doing grassroots lobbying largely as a volunteer most of my adult life. And it's been pretty inspiring to know how much impact grassroots lobbying, people, you know, you're not getting paid $600 an hour, you're not, you know, sitting in a suit in a room with AT&T or, you know, the speaker, you're not that guy, you're us. And what can we do? The truth is we can do a tremendous amount. And so I'm going to run through what I'm going to call the 7 philosophies of grassroots lobbying, and hope that by the end of this quick run through, you'll kind of have a vision for why it is that this is actually something that you can do and feel empowered about. So, how did I make this work?
Might have to click into it first.
Click into it first. Ah, here we go. So, oops. No, I do not want my mission control to be on. I probably had to accept the terms of it. Yes, terms and so the first philosophy of grassroots lobbying is that you don't win if you don't show up. And that sounds really simple. But if you think about all the legislative sessions that you never showed up at, you personally and everyone you know, it gives you a window into why we don't feel empowered to win. If you don't show up, you never win. So showing up, what does that mean? I want to talk briefly about what makes Texas special. If you have to show up in Congress as a grassroots lobbyist, you have to show up every day, all the time. You have to show up even when they don't have to show up. Like they work like 8 days a year. But if you're a grassroots lobbyist in Congress, you have to show up all of the days and a lot of the weekends. And nothing ever passes. So you have to keep showing up. And if you're a movement builder, you have to keep buying the pizza and getting the people to come to the meetings. And after a certain amount of time, when people have shown up a lot and they've eaten too much pizza and they're just sick of it, your movement dissipates. This happens everywhere, all over the country. Here, it doesn't have to happen. And that is written into the Texas Constitution. Our session is 140 days every 2 years. That's the only time you have to show up. You don't even have to show up all 140 days, because they show up as they did this week, and they spend the first month kind of partying and talking to each other and passing resolutions celebrating the Girl Scouts of America.
It's in the Constitution, they can't hear a bill for 30 days.
Right, the first 30 days, they really do a lot of resolutions about, making the turkey the official bird of Williamson County or whatever. So when you get down to it, you have to show up for about 90 days. Now, those are a pretty intense 90 days. You have to say to yourself, I'm going to figure out I can do these hours. If I can come at 7 and leave at 9, or, I can do background research and be there, giving stuff to the people who can show up. You have to be part of a team for about 90 days. And if you can do that and commit a certain number of hours for 90 days, you can win. Now, you can't just show up once. How many people here have been to a lobby day? Yay, lobby days! Lobby days are a gesture in the direction of showing up. They are sending a message, usually from large organizations, that we have the power to get people to show up. That's all they say. The communication that you have with the members at a lobby day is largely irrelevant to the process. You're showing up just to show that you will. If you only do it once, it's kind of a weak message. People who create a team, form a grassroots lobby, and show up all the time actually build relationships. You get to know the guys, you get to know the staff, you get to understand what motivates them. And you keep showing up and you keep talking to them, and pretty soon you're the guy they call when they have a question, or they want to know what the law is, or they want to know just your opinion because they're about to do an amendment. And then finally, that relationship building part, you only have to build relationships with a majority of exactly 181 people. This is a countable number. You can look at their faces in the little booklet, you can kind of figure out who they are, you can divvy them up because none of us can really get relationships with 181 people. But it's a doable thing. Then, if you've got the ability to think about the concept of jumping in as a grassroots lobbyist and volunteering your time for 90 days, it's a doable thing. At that point, it becomes about the 181 people. I'm standing up here in my Goodwill suit because it's not about me. So I make an effort to make it as not about me as humanly possible. When I show up, it's about the real thing in the world that I'm trying to change and the view of a bunch of people who are not me. They're not Claire, they're not Scott, or anyone in this room. And they have their own attention, their own lens that they look at the world through. So, third philosophy. People don't have to share your philosophy to agree with you on a thing. That's not just this thing, that's generalizable. You can find common ground with almost anyone on something. So the question is, there's 181 of them, they all have a worldview, there is some cross-section of their worldview that crosses yours, and that is what you bring to them. So maybe you're coming at the privacy issue from the criminal justice side, like Grits for Breakfast does, and you want to see fairness in the criminal justice system. That's really not the first question. The first question is, why does this guy want warrants for digital privacy? He may be a Fourth Amendment purist. He may be a constitutionalist. He may be a libertarian. He may come at this from a whole different viewpoint. If you can find it, you can talk to him about it. just about everything that actually passes does so based on a variety of contradictory philosophies. You have to get liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans, business Republicans, libertarians. You have to get all those people to agree on something. Philosophy. Laws are just ideas written in English. You don't have to be afraid of reading the statutes. You don't have to be afraid of reading the laws that they are an amendment to. It's just English. Anyone who wants to volunteer, will get some training in kind of getting the hang of understanding the statute. I was going to go through a little bit of that here, but I think it's too detailed. There's a website, capital.state.tx.us, free tracking service through that website. Rocks, librarians in the Capitol, they're like the handmaidens to grassroots lobbyists. They will help you and answer all your questions and make it easier for you to participate. When we do a more detailed training in the statutes, there's the way that courts view the statutes. Courts view the statute as a thing that describes the policy of a state. Like, what was that, those little songs we learned when we were in school, how a bill becomes a law? Don't look at it that way. When you read a statute, what you have to see it as is the historical remainder of a giant bloody fist fight. And you can see the bodies laying on the field if you look for them. Every political fight has winners and losers, and you can read it in the statute. You just have to think of it that way. So if you read the criminal code and you come to the place, or I'm going to throw out a different example because I was just doing this one recently. There are parts of the statutes governing police that limit the outcome of a civil service review of a behavior problem. They either can be completely right and get all their benefits back, or they're completely wrong and they get fired. Well, that's a very strange public policy. It means that, like, basically, if you want to fire a police officer for something, he gets a process by which at the end of the day, there's sort of a black and white solution. There's not really a, well, you know, like they do in other criminal prosecutions, sort of like a, okay, we're going to plea bargain. There's no plea bargain. There's no kind of negotiation. Well, that was the result of a fight over how we're going to discipline police officers. And I promise police officers won that fight. It wasn't a best public policy solution. It was a battle that somebody won and somebody lost. So if you think of the statutes that way, and then you kind of run your eye over the ones related to privacy, you find a lot of protection for companies, not a lot of protection for people, a lot of open-ended options for police officers and prosecutors. They get pretty much whatever they want, whenever they want it. And all we need to do is show up. And that's what we're going to do. Really quick, who here is a gamer? There must be some. This is an EFF group, right? No gamers in the room. Okay, I even set this up for you guys.
Pretend we are.
I'll pretend you are. Basically, the legislative session is run by rules. It's like a game. You don't have to not take it seriously. You can take it seriously. But thinking about the rules and then learning how to break them is part of the fun, if you like. And finally, you have 181 people you need to convince, and the way that it works is often more about culture than policy. The House is a lot like, well, the whole thing is a bit like high school. The House works by clicks. There's a lot more of them, and they can't read all the bills. There's 7,000 bills filed. None of those guys have time for that in 90 days. So they rely on each other. They look to see where their clique is moving. And part of the strategy for passing bills is just finding a few people who are going to lead the charge, who run the cliques, and bring the votes. In the Senate, there's only 30 of them. They all know each other. It's like being in a high school cafeteria. So you kind of have to learn to navigate something that's much more personal and less well understood. But nonetheless, fun. So, 90 days. Who's up for it? Yes. Oh, questions?
Yeah. What is your opinion on like showing up as compared to phone calls as compared to emails? Do phone calls and emails, how much do they, if you can, when people are really busy, they can't show up?
Right. So, showing up totally works better.
Yeah.
But not everybody can show up. So if you have a group like TAG, and you have a lot of people, especially outside of Austin, right? We're all lucky in the sense that if we want to participate and we live in Austin, we can walk, it's like it's down the street, right? We live here. If you don't live here, if you're trying to participate from Dallas, kind of more difficult. So all of those other strategies for reaching out and bringing people to communicate with their members are totally worthwhile. They are very important. Do they really carry the ball over the finish line? You need to have those people working on the ground too.
And the media is extremely important too. If it's in the media, they look at it and they feel it's more important, right? Like if it's a issue that gets media focused.
Yes, you want to have a media strategy, absolutely.
Towards that end, can you talk a little bit about the difference between inside game and outside game?
Right. So there was there's a lot of ways to talk about that, but bottom up, top down, inside game, outside game, you know, the sort of center and periphery, however you want to think about those pillars. In the end, it's all of them. So to pass bills, and we've, you know, Scott's passed a lot. I've had the pleasure of passing a lot back in the day. It's a balance of process, paying attention to the process. That is part of being inside. That is the showing up. It's hard to know the process really well. It's really hard to even be informed really well if you're not regularly showing up. But those people who know the process then are able to ping the people when it's time. And if you can time those outside game strategies, email, letters, calls, lobby days, you know, protests, all of those other things. Even mainstream media is largely an outside game strategy. If you can time those activities to match the calendar and the actual decisions that are being made and the inside part, then it's perfect. And you kind of need to be doing both things.
One other question. As far as legislation for this session goes, what bills specifically are you looking at and who's carrying them?
So our bill is starting out as the committee substitute for 1608 from last session. You can get online and look at that. 83rd regular capital
House Bill 1608.
House Bill 1608, as it came out of committee in the House last session, is kind of the starting point. But that bill doesn't cover MC catchers, which we just didn't really have enough information about last session to push that ball very far. It also doesn't cover geolocation because Edge Council would put in the bill. Anyway, many things that are going to get added back in. So we do have a House sponsor, Hughes.
Brian
Hughes.
Okay.
He's a total hero on this bill. He owns this bill to such a degree that no other member would want to step in his way. Like, this is his baby. In the Senate, we're looking at Estes or.
Well, there were two senators that carried it last session, Juan Hinojosa and Craig Estes, a Democrat and a Republican. Craig Estes was named chair in the interim of the State Affairs Committee.
And had the interim charge.
Which had an interim charge, which means an interim, a study assignment
Probably taking
in between sessions on our bill and on this topic. And so in the Senate, he may end up being the main one carrying it this time because he's had that experience.
And we're, you know, the coalition is just a piece of the work of all these other people that you see here. And we're an all volunteer group. So we're not trying to do everything. We sort of had some early meetings. Claire was there, part of that, some other folks in the room, where we talked about opening it up to commercial privacy. Some of these like, oh my God, what are my app vendors telling, I don't know, like that, those bigger questions. And I think we sort of at that earlier time thought we don't have enough volunteers to cover that much terrain. And if we keep it focused, we can probably get warrants for cell phone privacy this year.
And we did it for emails and content.
Right. So we kind of made the decision to keep the number of bills small in order to actually pass them.
Is there any updates or anything that need to be made to the one that got passed?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's going to have, I mean, it doesn't cover StingRays. It doesn't,
No, that would be that one.
it doesn't clearly enough define how cell tower dumps will be handled. It had some really great stuff on reporting and on data retention. I think the data retention stuff could even be better, and we have way more momentum after Snowden. So it'll get touched up, let's put it that way. Any other questions?
I guess, yeah, so you said it's the thing that was House Bill 1608 last session. So it will, at some point in time, it'll be obvious that it has a new number this session.
It'll be filed probably the next couple of weeks.
It will soon be refiled by Hughes with a new bill number for this new session. He may not put a lot of the new ideas into it at that first time. Part of what, and this gets to some of the discussion about model bills. The thing about model bills that's their strength is that they get people started. They make you feel like you can own the issue and take it to the members and like get the ball rolling. Like any bill, the first bill that gets filed is never, ever the bill that passes. And so, you know, part of what we're doing is just saying, yeah, we know we're gonna fix this bill. We don't really care, just file it. You know, get this bill filed, get it a bill number, start the process, and then all the good stuff comes in. And that's, you know, that's reasonable.
What is Brian Hughes' interest? Who is he? What is he excited about?
He is a libertarian leaning, I hate to use the word, but it's sort of Tea Party conservative.
Well, he's a Tea Party leader. He's one of 2 or 3 leaders of the Tea Party faction in the Texas House. And he's a guy who is one of these sort of constitutional,
right?
Purist is a good word. You know, and he's somebody who's, you know, got enough integrity to where he doesn't stop reading at the Second Amendment. He can, you know, keep going down and see that there's more to it. And I have to say, part of what happened, and one of the reasons he became so passionate and so into this, it was fascinating. We convinced him to file the bill, and he was interested, but it wasn't a true passion of his. And then the police unions came after, especially from Dallas and Houston, came after him like nobody's business. I mean, viciously, ruthlessly. I would walk into his office and his staffers on the phone, and you'd hear, you know, profanity coming out of the phone as she's holding it, you know, feet away from her ear, while the police unions are screaming at her. And frankly, it just pissed him off.
And you know, all of a sudden, this deal was like, oh, Scott brought me this. This is a good idea. I'll file it. I want to pass this thing because if they're going to do that, and it became very intense. So he's very invested now, and in fact, he went on. I don't know if anyone here knows what the American Legislative Exchange Council is. It's a national group that of conservative state legislators that come up with model legislation. And this experience got him on their committee, maybe even chaired it, that wrote the ALEC model legislation on electronic privacy. So he, by the end of session, had owned this to an enormous extent and is very dedicated to passing it. In the Senate, our bill authors are not as passionate about it, but you take.
I think Estes will be more passionate this session after we had an interim charge on the topic. His staff got educated, you know, that's what interim charges do. They don't really do much more than that, but they allow a leader to form around an issue because the staffers really work it during the interim. So I think we're gonna have a strategy to thread the needle in the Senate. That's been our tough nut. So we're gonna have to really work on that.
So I'm just going to take over and do kind of a call to action, but thank you, Captain. But I actually was going to really quickly run through a couple of things that I had put into my notes to talk about today. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of how things happened last session and some of the arguments we heard and whatnot. And at the end of that, I'm going to ask you if you want to get involved. We have a sign up and back. There's kind of a couple of different levels of engagement here. If you're just willing to like write a letter or an email related to your legislator, then go ahead and put your contact on there and we'll kind of send out something that's like, here's our fact sheet, please reference these talking points or whatever. And then if you're interested in actually working with us and making some of these visits and kind of providing your expertise as somebody that could talk to legislators, then we're going to have a training and Kathy will go over it even in more detail. So I'm going to talk about a little bit just about some of the specifics about why we had success and then some of the arguments we heard in opposition to the bill. And really I'm talking about this stuff to try to get you all interested and convince you this is a good thing to be doing. Just off the top of my head, I made a list of the reasons I thought we were successful last session. The first is that we had a bipartisan coalition, and it's a lot thanks to TAG. The libertarian side of things really evened out the ACLU's presence. So we had kind of a bipartisan situation, and obviously in the Senate we have a Democrat and a Republican author for the bill, so we're continuing that same approach. I think there's just a reality that Republicans kind of run the state legislature, so you need Republicans involved for sure. The second is that I think that there's a lot of power of talking about this issue as Texas is a national leader in the federal arena. The Snowden, particularly when Snowden stuff came out, I think that gave us a whole new way to talk about this bill. And the idea that we would limit local law enforcement, again, I sort of already touched on this, but that would maybe have implications for how federal actions would be taken. The third thing is one that has sort of been touched on, and I think it goes to why Brian Hughes is Brian Hughes, whoever asked that. Texas has never passed a DWI sobriety checkpoint law that allows law enforcement to do DWI sobriety checkpoints. And I think that ties in some ways to what we call what I think probably y'all coined this, but it's the right to be left alone, right? And it's sort of this like other Texas, it's like a Texified version of libertarianism, where it's like, you want to like be out on your land and not have people screwing with you or whatever. And so for whatever reason, legislators really hate sobriety checkpoints, and they've never passed it despite tons of pressure. I mean, you all dealt with this issue for years. So you could probably give more background than I could. But ultimately, lawmakers just think it's an inappropriate violation of their privacy to be pulled over with no reasonable suspicion on the side of the road. That is an instinct we want to build on, right? It is great that they feel that way. And so we're trying to translate that discomfort with things like sobriety checkpoints into your cell phone is functioning in a very similar manner, and you should be worried about it. So kind of building, in some ways, I guess we're pouring, new wine into old bottles or something. But I mean, talking about all this stuff in that way is effective. And the fourth thing, I guess, Ron, the strong author in the House, and really we talked about this, but he stood up to the police and prosecutors' opposition, which that's invaluable, and it's actually very difficult to find a legislator that can do that. They have a number of bills, and very often any one bill can torpedo their success with other stuff, and so they often are making political calculations. And for him to be willing to put this at the kind of the top of his political calculus, I think is incredible. I mean, we owe him the debt for moving it all last time and again this time.
And part of it, just to mention, we are very lucky. Brian Hughes is from Mineola, which is a tiny bit two-horse town out in East Texas. And all of the opposition came from Dallas and Houston. And so you have these police unions, telling, we're gonna have your head. And he's like, well, I'm from Mineola, what do I care about you? So having this rural guy who really didn't care about any of the big city politics, big city DAs didn't influence him at all. He talked to his DA, and when he said he was fine with it, he said, okay, I'm good, let's roll.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Just one little further tidbit, just to understand his district a little better. Miranda Lambert's hometown is in his district.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Whoa, cultural moment.
This is why we have to have the full spectrum. So the other thing about Brian Hughes that was really important is that he was very good at recruiting other legislators to be on board, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at HB 1608 from last session, there are over 100 people signed on and supported along as authors and co-authors and everything else. And so he was a really great organizer kind of in his capacity as an official legislator. Another thing that made it successful last time was Greg and a lot of other folks had done a good bit of research. And so people said, well, how do we know this is happening if you said it's a secret subpoena process? And we're like, well, we have all these different pieces of evidence. It was really important to have that. Now we've established it. I don't think it's as big a deal, but that's something, if we were to take on a different issue, we would have to kind of set that again. And then the last thing, and this is kind of a more philosophical thing, but I just think that there is an interest among, so you kind of have the factions of the Democrats, the Tea Party and far right, and then the centrist kind of business Republicans, right? And so there's a kind of, depending on how you read things, either the Tea Party is starting to have more influence or the business Republicans are starting to do things to try to appease this wing of the party. In either instance, kind of either description of the whole thing, stuff like this, where it's like a narrow privacy issue, is an easy thing for business Republicans to hand off or to give to like kind of the libertarian wing of the party. So what we were proposing in some ways was not as hard a lift as, say, ending abortion, right? Which would have maybe been another thing that the Tea Party folks would have wanted. So we were able to kind of provide like a more minimal recommendation or a more minimal piece of legislation that could give everybody in the legislature, particularly those trying to curry favor with Tea Party candidates, kind of a way to look like they're being Tea Party-ish. And so, you kind of had, it sort of played out interestingly, but I mean, I think it's always good to give people an opportunity ultimately to reduce the likelihood that they'll be challenged in their primary, right? And so our bill gave people kind of this Tea Party cred on some level. At least I like to think so. So the arguments we heard against it, and this is actually in a fact sheet on our website. So if you look at the coalition, you can review this. But here are just a few of the things that we had to argue against. First was the third-party doctrine. It's an established constitutional principle. It's one that we don't think is a good fit here, but it was enough of a conversation that we actually had to kind of address why this was not appropriate to be treated that way. The second was that there was an argument that the standard shouldn't necessarily be all the way up to probable cause, but it should be reasonable suspicion. And just kind of in short, reasonable suspicion is like if an officer is just worried for their own safety, they run into you on the street and they just pat down the outside of your clothing to make sure you're not like about to pull a knife on them. That's reasonable suspicion. Probable cause is you get a warrant and you can go into someone's home. So probable cause is stronger, although I think people very frequently underestimate how limited any of these standards really are. I mean, I think law enforcement is quite effective at meeting any of these standards, including probable cause. But we sort of heard this argument that probable cause was an onerous burden. And ultimately, I think it's the absolute right burden, and we had to make that argument. And that was one of the things that people had to kind of talk to offices about.
Yeah, go for it. One thing we found is that that law enforcement is using these techniques of gathering the geolocation data to establish probable cause in different cases. So it was one of those circumstances where you're maybe inclined to ask, well, gosh, how did you solve any crimes before people had mobile phones? But,
and meanwhile, they're having to establish probable cause in every other criminal context, right? That's the part that's really hard to take. You're like, but you always do this. This is how warrants work. So that was an interesting argument as well. There was some debate about the accuracy of historical data and what you could tell from historical cell data. That was something that we just kind of had to bring in experts to talk about.
Again, probably not so much this time. I think
I
think we've gotten over that hump.
We ended up talking a lot about kind of emergency provisions and if this stuff could be used, if there would be a warrant requirement, for example, when there's a fugitive involved, all these other things. And ultimately, a bill like this has to have an emergency provision of some kind. And so it was really a question of how to communicate that like law enforcement is using this as kind of like maybe it's being overstated, how important it is to have this emergency provision. I think we all knew we would have to have one at some point, and we never really disagreed with law enforcement, but that was sort of posed as an issue sometimes, that like, oh, well, what happens if somebody's kidnapped and you want to track their phone? And the answer was, we already addressed that in the bill, but sometimes you'd have to actually literally go tell people that. So then there were some police departments, there really were kind of like three separate, like some police departments may have been using some kind of process where they were seeking some kind of warrant. That there's the secret subpoena process, and then there's kind of a federal process as well. And so there was just kind of confusion about who's using which processes. And so that was something we had to talk about and communicate with offices about. And then, let's see, there's just a couple more, at one point, prosecutors were saying that the bill was both poorly drafted and overly broad. So we had to kind of address that, like, actually, it's pretty narrowly tailored, honestly, and it doesn't, if anything, I mean, well, we certainly could have made it more broad. So, emergency exception, and then I guess kind of the final one, and one of the things I thought was really important about the bill 1608, the cell phone bill, was that there was a reporting requirement so that we would start to get a real sense of how often this authority is used. And I think anytime you add a reporting requirement, there's always a complaint that it's too onerous to do the reporting. And again, law enforcement reports all kinds of stuff. And so many times these were just situations where there would be an argument and you just have to address it with the office. So these are kind of things we go around. We talk about the underlying legislation, why it's important, what's happening, in the technological realm, just updating really talking about updating the Fourth Amendment in some ways. And then you kind of go through and kind of address different concerns people raise. Oh, your bill's too broad. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, is it too broad? We're not going to be able to get this in this emergency situation. Well, actually, these provisions are a little bit lower in the bill. Just keep reading. And so that's
keep reading is always a good idea.
We can say that.
No, it's on page 2, I promise.
But anyway, that's sort of a glimpse. These are like kind of this array of arguments, or what we went and talked to the legislature about. So again, there's a sign up and back, and we'd love to have you all just contact your legislator that represents you. That's helpful for sure, and support the bill. We can. I'm sure that there'll be more about the bill once it's filed. There's a number and everything. I'm sure you all will be hearing about it through various listservs. And then, and again, we're going to have a training and bring people on to work with us again this session on these bills. And I for one, I think we all are pretty optimistic. I think that there's a really good reason to be optimistic. And frankly, if anybody that has worked with me before knows I never say stuff like that. So I'm incredibly pessimistic by nature.
ACLU does not walk into the Texas legislature saying I'm optimistic.
So just for the sake of argument, or for the sake of background, just know I'm not usually this optimistic. So anyway, it's great. I know I'm speaking for all of us. I appreciate the chance to talk to you all, and thanks for your interest in this issue. Yeah.
Yeah. When the bill comes out, can you send it out? A note out to the Meetup or whatever.
We'll do so.
You can also sign up yourself on the legislative website to get that alert.
Once it has a bill.
Oh, it won't do it from the past session.
Yeah.
No, right. Never mind.
You gotta have a bill number.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, I think it's not just for you, but
yeah.
You're not a single issue organization. So how many other bills are you working on? Are they cross-purpose? How much of your attention does this specifically have?
TxEPC?
No, well, ACLU.
Oh, ACLU.
Well, I work on a lot of other issues. Right. I mean, that's, but.
Is this much of your time, a little of your time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's, I probably work in about 6 or 7 coalitions, and this is one of them. So, I mean, I guess it's, divided that way. I think a lot of times, though, it's not just me, I guess, that's in this. We've brought Chris Segoy in here a couple of times to support the coalition, and we have kind of folks at the national level that can help with some of the drafting and everything. So there's, it's not just my time, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Scott?
Yeah, I was going to say that the way that our little group has worked is that Matt, of course, works for ACLU.
I lobby for the Innocence Project of Texas and the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. So both of us are already up to the legislature a lot.
Right.
And we're working these main committees that these bills are going through already. And so we can do a lot of the heavy lifting and make sure that I's get dotted if there's not a volunteer to do stuff. And then when we have to get to a lot of offices, when we have to, have the big floor vote or whatever, then that's where the volunteers come in, and we try and give a lot of training. We usually have 2 or 3 training sessions before we send folks out, and we your first couple of times have a more experienced person go with you. And so, but the volunteers are playing a support role to those of us who are up there.
The volunteers are also taking the lead. I mean,
They are, but
I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Well, I think,
How many office visits do you think you did last time, just to start with?
gosh, a lot.
Right?
A lot. But the first thing I did was follow Scott around to a few office visits and kind of get the hang of it. And I wasn't doing much of like the heavy focus lifting. It was like a lot of boxes in and out to the car. And so I had a sheet, we had a sheet. I wasn't talking to the legislators directly. We go in, whoever the staff person is who's there to receive everybody. And you just go in and talk to them and introduce the issue, and you've got a few main points, and you kind of go and do the same spiel over and over again. But having somebody like look them in the eye that's a reasonable person and put it on the radar, and it was actually kind of easy to engage the staffers because chances are they had much more tech savvy than the people they were working for. And so that helped get the issue on the radar, and then it maybe got through a little meeting briefing. So then when Brian Hughes is over there working the floor, that all those things help come together to get those supporters. So
and you did like well work, right? Before floor votes?
Yeah, a little bit of that, and then
The well means standing out as they walk into the House of Representatives and handing them flyers.
On the
or
day of
whatever.
the vote, you want everybody to have something in their hand, and you want them to have like looked you in the eye and know there's a person waiting out there about this thing that they have in their hand. So there's a lot of little touch points.
And so I didn't, I might not be the one who's deep in the weeds with getting but I get updated. Okay, where are we now? Who are we talking to? And then you kind of deploy accordingly.
And Claire's experience, I think, was just wonderful. She really showed up as a neophyte, threw herself into it, and by the end, it was amazing. And we just say, okay, we need to hit these 30 people, and Claire just go and come back with detailed notes and tell you what everybody said, and was enthusiastic about it. Got lots of intelligence, and so once you get that training and get over the hump of sort of that initial fear of engaging, there's really no limit to how engaged you can get. And
I would raise one point really quickly. This is actually a great time to mention, if you have availability during the day, like during business hours, that is a huge commodity for volunteering on this stuff.
I was fun
that was something
at
that
the
Claire
time,
really,
but now I'll have to take off strategic time.
Right, which is kind of what I do. Like I do evening, or like if I can come in a little late in the morning, I'll go over there early and do a couple hours and then go to work, and then so.
And then
we all
as
do.
you get later in the session, don't they start to stay farther
They
in
do,
the
yeah.
evening?
Those 90 crazy days, by about the middle, they're spending the night, like they're all just.
So I get off work at 5, and if they're by 5:30, they're still there.
Absolutely.
We're just getting started.
Yeah, just really digging in.
So daytime, he's right, daytime
Yeah.
hours are at a premium, but we all know that volunteers typically.
And those committee hearings ended up being kind of late.
Committee hearings, yes. There will be very specific moments to show up for committee hearings, and they typically run all night. I mean, they will run till 2 and 3.
But they don't happen all the time.
Right.
If you want, I mean, one thing, speaking of committee hearings, one thing you can do to kind of get a sense of who was on which side for HB 1608 is you can look at the committee hearing witness list. It's there in TLO.
You can watch it online.
You can actually watch the hearing as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you know, I mean, you get kind of a sense for what the conversation was, you know.
So one note on the scope of the coalition's work, as we were saying earlier, we wanted to narrowly focus on this one particular bill, just in terms of the quantity of folks that we have to work on it, but also just a focus. But there's a lot of other bills that are going to be brought up in the legislature this session, which have a privacy or online component to it all that may be of interest to ACLU, may be of interest to EFF-Austin. And I think that there's a point of diminishing returns in terms of, well, how much can we actually contribute to opposing these bills or standing in favor of these bills? So, but I think we want to be aware of those. So as you see bills, like if you're engaged with the legislative session, as you see those items, like let us know about them. I mean, we're going to be doing some tracking of the different bills, but you know, as Kathy said, last session there were 7,000 bills. So, you know, as many eyes as we can have on the stuff that's going through. And if some of these things, if they're silly, you know, it doesn't take a lot to actually take them down. So, you know, we want to be informed about what's actually happening up there. Everyone can help with that.
When you say the coalition, that is
The Texas Electronic Privacy
Electronic Privacy Coalition, TxEPC.org. EPC.
and it's a coalition of
It's EFF, TAG, ACLU, the Force, the Reform the Force,
Texas Civil Rights Project.
Texas Civil Rights Project. There's someone else that I'm forgetting.
There's a newer one that just came on or something. Fresh break just a few months ago.
But this is the core, you know, the folks that are actually participating.
And just to review one more time, Matt, if folks want to get involved in potentially doing any of this work, whether it means office visits or potentially doing bill tracking of any sort, how would they best get involved?
Yeah, I mean, please do sign up and on the list back there, and definitely we'll share it. Actually, you can also, well, that's the ACLU's general Twitter. My Twitter is probably not that useful to contact me, but my email is also hsimpson@aclutx.org if any of y'all want to contact me that way, and I'm more than happy to kind of shepherd you into or make sure you get involved with the coalition.
But sign up and we'll plug you in.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have any other questions or comments? All right.
I know it's not the focus, sort of the wider questions of internet privacy beyond this governmental stuff, but Tom and I, and perhaps others, attend the Internet Identity Workshop a couple times a year out in at the Computer History Museum, and I recommend it to everybody.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thank y'all all for coming tonight. One more round of applause. Y'all might have noticed me fiddling with the video there a couple times. Trying to record this, but the camera has a weird quirk where when it cycles through inputs, it likes to reset its position. So it hasn't been pointed there. But there has been a microphone recording this entire session, and that will go up along with the slides that were presented tonight.
Gosh, I hope I didn't say anything about you.
at EFF-Austin.org. So, yeah, thank y'all for coming. Get on the sign-up list, and we do have swag back there if you'd like to contribute. If you parked in the Omni Garage, get your parking validator at the front desk before you head out.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't.
We're on if you do. And we're back next month. We'll announce what the topic is here in a week or two.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.